You're putting on sound bites here. That's what you're doing, and I know that. So let's talk about, if I'm going to be in this debate, let's talk about me and my system, and quit going back to the other system, which you're perpetually doing. And that's why I feel like I'm being personally attacked by you.
But they're not in agriculture either, many of them, right? They're modelers, they're economists, they're these other folks.
They're also not funded by industry either, right? So that would be a benefit to some extent, wouldn't it? Like, wouldn't that skew a bit results sometimes too when there's a lot of industry funding involved?
So, let's go ad hominem there, bud.
Nick, I think you have done an incredible job reading and memorizing an enormous quantity of research work. I don't think you've ever regenerated much degraded land.
I got unreasonably angry after watching this debate. And then I realized it was a great opportunity to teach people how to arm themselves against misinformation. So even if you don't care about the holistic grazing debate, this is still going to be useful because I'm going to break down the tactics that people use to peddle propaganda and dishonesty. All right, so there were two reasons I got so mad when I watched this. First, the regenerative grazing side of this debate just used so many tired and subtle dishonest tactics. And two, because I think a lot of people could watch this and not really see them for what they are. And it seems like even Nick and Ellen may have been taken in by a few of them, at least in the moment.
I don't think you will find anywhere in anything I've ever written or said or put out in which I was critical of plant-based regenerative agriculture. But you have been very critical of my animal regenerative agriculture.
Yep, that's fair.
So again, you're the aggressor here.
I think that's a fair point, but I'm standing up for nature.
So it's the dishonesty paired with the very calculated execution that got my hackles up. So Nick Carter, the scientist on the plant-based side of this debate, seems to come at this conversation from the perspective of one scientist hashing out a disagreement with another scientist. But the holistic grazing side is not playing that game. They're playing a very audience-facing game. My read is that they're basically trying to weave together a narrative that plays on emotion and a lay understanding of science. And they do this by repeatedly underscoring a couple high-level talking points. And those talking points, as far as I can tell, are some approximation of this. You're attacking us, and we're the victim.
And that's why I feel like I'm being personally attacked by you.
You're an elite in your ivory tower who just doesn't understand what farmers are dealing with.
And I think it's an act of incredible privilege for you to decide how people who've been on the land all their life should manage that land. I'm blown away by that arrogance and privilege.
You worship your fancy reductionist science, and that can never really tell us how the real world works because the real world is just complicated, basically trying to sow doubt and erode confidence in science.
I hear these scientists argue endlessly on the scientific method of measuring carbon. Just because you're using reductionist science, both sides, no matter who it is using reductionist science that was developed for a laboratory situation where things can be very precisely managed.
We are being very polite and reasonable. We aren't naive, and we know that there's bad things on both sides. You just think only animal ag is bad.
I have a heart for biodiversity. I have a heart for wildlife. I have a heart for all those things.
I really worry about you dogmatic clinging to eating only plants.
And respect, Nick, the guys that you talked about.
Someone else could choose to make the same choice with plant regenerative agriculture. That's fine. I support them.
I'd like to understand why you want to debunk the work that he's done. And I mean, I don't necessarily appreciate the fact that you're putting out all this media and you never called me, right? Like, I'd have been happy to talk to you about the work we did or the challenges we might have had. I mean, I'm sure we could probably get along.
Now, the most entertaining tactic is them playing the victim, but we're going to save that for later because I want to get to the most important one first, which is sowing doubt and eroding confidence in science.
None of these papers, they never factor in what's happening with soil carbon. These studies, they're just done in these very simplified continuous grazing systems that are low in terms of productivity. That management doesn't get taken into any of this data or any of the meta-analyses. And I think that there is a lot of complexity in that we just blanketly do meta-analysis over the world. And I think those are the things that we miss in these meta-analyses, is that what if we were to take all that out? And so I've worked with people that would indicate that they do believe that we could keep the cattle numbers fairly the same and shift into more of a grass-based system. But I've never felt confident in those numbers. I've never felt really confident saying one way or the other, to be honest with you.
So this isn't just a theme in this video or this debate. People who peddle misinformation tend to follow a pretty similar playbook. And if you want to know more about that playbook, check out the book or documentary, Merchants of Doubt. So what's basically happening is Nick keeps referencing meta-analyses, and Jason Jason keeps listing limitations of those meta-analyses. And the problem is, as an observer of this debate, this can sort of leave the impression that each got a couple of good licks in, and science is just kind of complicated, and it's hard to say what's the better system. But this actually makes no sense. Taken as is, the reasonable conclusion is that Nick's explanation of the world is much more likely. But why is that? Well, the first thing to understand is meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is like a study that's a synthesis of a bunch of other studies. In science, there's a hierarchy of evidence, with some evidence being recognized as stronger than others, and meta-analyses are generally at the top. So let's say one person shows you a meta-analysis that cigarettes cause cancer, and then another person shows you a single cohort study that cigarettes don't cause cancer. And let's say that's all you have to go on. The reasonable thing to conclude is that it's more likely that cigarettes cause cancer. And then similarly, if someone shows you 20 meta-analyses that cigarettes cause cancer, and someone else shows you a single meta-analysis that cigarettes don't cause cancer, the reasonable thing to conclude is that cigarettes cause cancer. The second thing to understand is that all studies have limitations. Designing a study is a series of trade-offs, in the same way that virtually every decision in life is a series of trade-offs. So let's say you've been accepted for 2 jobs. The first one is 10 miles from your house and pays $80,000, and the second one is 9 miles from your house and pays $30,000. Then your friend comes along and says, you shouldn't take the first job, it's farther away. They're not factually wrong about that, but this is terrible advice. In a similar way, much of this debate is Nick citing studies and meta-analyses, and those studies are showing that plant-based agriculture creates a significantly lower environmental impact. And then Jason's just pointing out limitations. So Jason in some sense is just highlighting a trivial truth that studies have limitations, but he's not then offering his own evidence in support of some counterclaim, a claim like animal and plant ag aren't very different in terms of environmental impact. So for it to be reasonable for us to doubt Nick's conclusions and accept Jason's, we need to see Jason present a similar quantity and quality of evidence with limitations that were less numerous or less significant. But what he does is mostly just list limitations of the studies that Nick cites. And this happens in so many debates. One side presents a mountain of evidence. The other side makes the trivially true observation that those studies have limitations, maybe cites a random study or two of their own, and some portion of the audience walks away feeling like both positions are basically equally supported. But they're not. Think about when you're done listening to a highly technical debate for a second. You probably can't actually recall that much of the factual information they talked about, but you probably have a rough impression of who you think won. Pointing out limitations without citing counter evidence is one way to manage that impression without actually needing to have much evidence on your side. And just to put a super fine point on this, I'm not saying study limitations are irrelevant, or that they can't be really damning, especially if the results of the study haven't been replicated. But what I am saying is this. Imagine you ask yourself, I wonder if plant agriculture is better, the same as, or worse than animal agriculture, generally speaking. Then one person presents this evidence in support of plant agriculture being better, and another person presents this evidence in support of plant and animal agriculture being roughly the same. And then the second person points out that there's some limitations in the first person's studies, knowing full well there's limitations in their studies as well. The reasonable conclusion based on this information is not that it's all complicated and you can't really make any conclusions with any sort of confidence. The reasonable conclusion is that position 1 is clearly better supported than either of the other conclusions. And as such, as we move forward, we should be acting in accordance with that information. All right, so let's check out one of the few times that Jason does explicitly reference a study.
The White and Hall paper in PNAS would suggest highly differently, right? Where they did their model, and their model said if we go to a 100% plant-based diet in the United States, that we only gain like 3% on emissions, and we have micronutrient deficiencies, right? So that model's in PNAS, but of course you're not going to agree with it, right? And the fact is that everybody's got the model, and everybody can talk these numbers based on what behooves them, and you can have your science and I can have my science.
Now first I'll just say my jaw hit the floor when I heard him say you can have your science and I can have my science. I've been in science-related careers most of my adult life, and this just isn't a phrase you hear come out of scientists' mouths very often, if ever, honestly. This is more the sort of thing a politician would say. Now this doesn't deductively prove that he's being dishonest, but it is a red flag. And the problem is that it gets even worse when we look at the particular study that he's claiming as his science. But I'm gonna let Gil from the channel Nutrition Made Simple explain, since he did a great job in this video from a year ago.
So let's look at what the study actually did. They ran a simulation where we stopped raising animals to eat. But we keep growing all of their food. We keep growing tons and tons of corn, even though all the cows and pigs and chickens are gone. In fact, the free space left by the animals, we use it to grow more crops, but at the current proportions we use right now with all the billions of animals. So a lot more corn. And because we don't have the manure anymore, we have to synthesize fertilizer industrially to grow all of those crops, creating more emissions. So the conditions they chose to simulate in the study are that we are condemned to produce fertilizer industrially to grow tons and tons of corn we don't need to feed billions of animals that don't exist anymore. So what do we do with all those tons of corn that are left? According to the conditions they chose for their simulation, we would eat it. So in their simulation, our diet would be 80% grains and mostly corn. And not a normal amount of food, a huge amount, an excess of dietary energy. Because we have all this leftover corn and no cows to eat it. And not surprisingly, they found that this diet was not nutritionally ideal, that it led to some potential deficiencies. And even in this outlandish scenario where we just keep producing tons and tons of crops we don't need, they still found it was better for the environment. They saw a statistically significant reduction in emissions compared to the current system with all the animals. But they conclude the magnitude of the difference wasn't that impressive if we do it like that. Yeah, if we keep producing all of the animal food, even though all the animals are gone, yeah, the emissions are not going to come down as much. But no one is suggesting that as a solution. Now, maybe this sounds a bit too weird to be true. Maybe I'm presenting the study unfairly. How do you know you can trust me? Well, you don't need to. Several teams of scientists from different countries wrote to the editors of the journal expressing their concern about this study, and the journal published those letters. Here's one from European scientists, titled "Causing Confusion in the Debate About the Transition Toward a More Plant-Based Diet." It explains that in the study, nutrient deficiencies may have arisen from the unbalanced diet assumed in the plant-based scenario, with grains being 80% of daily consumption. Here's another letter from the US titled, "Without animals, farmers would reduce feed crop production." Yeah, farmers would stop growing food for cows if there weren't any cows around. The titles of the letters almost tell the whole story. The authors of the study unrealistically assume that without livestock, Americans would continue to grow animal feed and just incorporate it into human diets. Feed crops take up 75% of US cropland. Without livestock, all that land could be used to grow vegetables, biofuel crops, food for export, and provide critical habitat for native wildlife. By eliminating the need for animal feed, farmers could transition to a wider variety of grasses, grains, pulses, vegetables, and fruits that would be healthier for humans and the environment. Here's another letter by scientists from Harvard and Oxford called "Feedlot Diet for Americans," resulting from a misspecified optimization algorithm. Because that's what we nerds sound like when we throw shade. The way the authors did the study is particularly nonsensical, as exemplified by their plant-based scenario. An energy intake twice that of an average adult, at almost 5,000 calories a day, with about 3,000 calories a day coming from corn. That's 24 ears of corn every day per person and a half. And out of the 5,000 calories of food, over 4,000 calories from grains every day. More diverse diets, including vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, legumes, would be possible. However, unfortunately, all the results in the study were based on implausible scenarios and therefore cannot represent realistic examples. The authors replied, and they don't dispute the basic facts of the study, all those numbers. They basically said this is the scenario they wanted to test. If farmers did not change their crops and kept putting out corn, and that's all that people had, what would happen? That was their focus. They conclude, our study's approach differs drastically from others in this field. So yes, if we eliminate the animals but keep producing all of their food and synthesize fertilizers to grow that food and start eating 5,000 calories a day, over half of which from corn, then yeah, the reduction in emissions is not going to be huge, and health-wise, that's not going to be great. That's what the study tested.
Now, maybe you're still super skeptical. You're saying something like, yeah, well, Nick's studies have limitations and so does this one that Jason cites, so I guess they're the same. Even if I accepted that, Nick has still presented a much higher quantity of evidence. But saying this White and Hall study just has some limitations is really underselling it. The study's testing some random hypothetical scenario that no one's calling for, where the population is basically eating twice the number of recommended calories, and most of it is coming from corn that we never stopped growing, even though we didn't need it to feed animals anymore. This isn't just a limitation, it's barely even relevant to this debate. But the cherry on top is that even after all that, it still finds a decrease in GHG emissions. So both Nick's science and Jason's science find a reduction when looking at plant-based agriculture. And remember, this is one of the only studies that Jason explicitly cites in this interview. So I'm assuming he thinks this is one of his heavy hitters.
For me, instead of having these big thought experiments on what to eat and how to do this throughout the world, It's just starting at a local basis and working with people.
So a thought experiment is typically understood to be a hypothetical scenario like the trolley problem, and you use it to get a better understanding of some scientific or philosophical principle. You, as an individual, think through it in your head, and often a hallmark of these thought experiments is that there isn't an obviously correct answer, or at least that there's disagreement on what the correct answer is. A meta-analysis, on the other hand, combines multiple studies conducted by multiple experts in the field, using multiple statistical analyses, having gone through multiple rounds of peer review by other colleagues, and then the meta-analysis itself is subject to statistical analysis and peer review. And Nick presents multiple meta-analyses. Using a phrase like thought experiments to refer to those meta-analyses is just such a ludicrous and erroneous undersell of the time, the effort, and the mathematical rigor that goes into them.
Sit there and cherry pick studies, based on a lot of these meta models.
Cherry picking. Yeah, let's take a quick look at the tiny fraction of studies that Nick decided to cherry pick for this debate. Or how about the tiny fraction he decided to cherry pick on his website?
I hear these scientists argue endlessly on the scientific method of measuring carbon. And I get that. Just because you're using reductionist science, both sides, no matter who it is using reductionist science.
Ooh, both sides. Here's the thing about both sides. Both sides does a lot of work when you're peddling doubt, but that work almost exclusively benefits the status quo. The first problem is that saying both sides have pros and cons can be trivially true and simultaneously meaningless and unhelpful. Think of the two job scenarios I presented earlier. And that's the thing. It is technically correct, but the quantity and quality of those pros and cons is deeply important. The second problem is that it sounds intuitively correct. It really feels like if you have two sides taking different positions, well, the reasonable conclusion is that the truth lies somewhere near the middle. But let's think about when the debate was raging about whether cigarettes cause lung cancer, or if we should maintain chattel slavery, or give women the right to vote. Was the reasonable conclusion to say the truth lies somewhere close to the middle? Should we have only given women with blue eyes the right to vote? And the third problem is that both sides generates doubt, which generates inaction, which favors the status quo. And that prevents real change. And that's the point. Thinking both sides have some good points and gee golly, it is all just sort of complicated and nuanced and not totally clear, that's not going to be the spark that changes your behavior, and they know it. And if you think this sounds far-fetched or too uncharitable, check out the book/documentary I talked about earlier called Merchants of Doubt. It basically catalogs how numerous industries have used the same doubt playbook over and over for the same purpose for things like smoking, DDT, acid rain, and climate change. And that book even gets its name from an internal tobacco industry memo where one of the executives said, "Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public." And maybe you're thinking, yeah, but that's just a biased book and just like one person's opinion, man. Well, luckily there's an entire field of study called agnotology that studies just this sort of thing. All right, so in summary, relatively speaking, Jason barely presents any peer-reviewed evidence. None of the evidence he does cite is at the quality level of meta-analysis. One of the few studies he does explicitly cite was almost laughably irrelevant and yet still showed that removing animals lowered GHG emissions. He uses language and rhetoric more common of a politician than a scientist, and he thinks this is just cherry picking. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. In the next video, I'm going to break down the playing the victim angle and possibly some other stuff. So if you want to see that video or have any other observations, drop them in the comments below. And if you want to help me make this my full-time career, check out the Patreon in the description. And shout out to Ryan O'Neill, Tom Eisenbeiss, NetBase News, Monstar, David Yastrzemski, and Maxwell Edison.